On my sister's wedding day, I had everything planned perfectly, but one message changed everything. Don't go to the wedding, check your husband's office. I couldn't believe my eyes when I walked in. My husband. He and my best friend had been deceiving me for years, and I was just a pawn in their game. I didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear. Everything I had believed in collapsed in an instant, and my life from that moment on would never be the same. If you think this is just a typical family story, then you're wrong. Hit that subscribe button now before we dive in to not miss more shocking stories from us. The day had arrived. The one Jessica had been waiting for her whole life. Her wedding. The day everyone in the family had marked on their calendars, the day they would celebrate her beauty, her success, her place at the center of it all. Mary, as usual, would take a step back, as she always had. Mary stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the simple mauve dress she had chosen for the occasion. It was tasteful, modest, nothing too flashy. She knew better than to try and outshine Jessica. The contrast between them was always stark. Jessica the radiant, the outgoing one, the one who shone in every room. And then there was Mary, the quiet one, the one who stood in the shadows waiting for her moment, but always finding herself waiting. As Mary brushed her hair, she thought about how her life had always been a backdrop to Jessica's. They had grown up together, but it always felt like there was no room for Mary in the spotlight. Jessica's accomplishments were always celebrated first, and Mary's quietly performed the tasks. No one noticed the things that kept the world running smoothly, but never made her the focus. The sun filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the room. It was one of those moments when everything felt like it was frozen in time, the peace before the storm. The wedding would begin soon, and Mary was meant to be part of it by default, as she always had been. Her role today was simple. Smile, stand at the side, be the supportive sister. Not too much, not too little, just enough. She had always been content with that role, though a small part of her felt the ache of being invisible. It wasn't that she didn't love Jessica, or that she wasn't happy for her. No, it was something more profound. Something about the way she had always been the second choice, the background, the afterthought. She grabbed the pearl hair clip that had belonged to their grandmother. She hadn't worn it in years, but today felt different. She needed a reminder of something beautiful that once belonged to her, something that didn't belong to Jessica. She slid it into her hair, adjusting it carefully. The clip clicked into place with a finality that resonated deeper than she expected. The quiet hum of the house, the sound of the wedding preparations outside seemed to fade as her mind wandered. She glanced at the clock. Time was slipping away. The wedding was starting soon. She was supposed to be part of the photos, the laughter, the joy. But today felt different. The gnawing feeling in her gut, the feeling that she didn't quite belong, had only intensified. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was a single vibration. She glanced at the screen, expecting another reminder from Jessica about the wedding. But it wasn't from Jessica. It was a message from an unknown number. Don't go to the wedding. Check your husband's office instead. The words hit her like a ton of bricks. Her breath caught in her throat as the words repeated in her mind. Don't go to the wedding. Check your husband's office. For a moment, she just stared at the message, her fingers frozen above the screen. What could this mean? Who would send her something like this? Was it a prank? A cruel joke? Or was it something more sinister? Her heart pounded in her chest as doubt began to gnaw at her. The message was so specific, so chilling. And the use of your husband, that was the key. The words felt like a knife twisting in her gut. She hadn't heard from anyone about Ethan today. Not that it would be unusual. He had his own things to take care of, probably busy with work. But then why this? Why now? The phone in her hand felt heavier with each passing second. She stood there frozen. Her mind raced, replaying every moment with Ethan over the past few weeks. He had been distant lately, not just in his usual way of being absorbed in work, but something else. The small things, like the way his hand lingered when they touched, the way he seemed to be looking past her more often than not. The warning signs had been there, but she had ignored them. She didn't want to be the suspicious wife, the paranoid one. But now she couldn't ignore it. Her breath quickened as her mind spun. What kind of person would she be if she ignored this? What kind of woman would she be if she just went to the wedding, like everything was fine, pretending not to know that something was wrong? She couldn't shake the feeling that the message was telling her something urgent, something that was impossible to ignore. She remembered a conversation she'd had with her therapist just 2 weeks ago. "You've swallowed so much silence, Mary," her therapist had said. "You don't even recognize your own scream." Mary swallowed hard. She had been swallowing silence for years, silencing her doubts, silencing her fears, silencing her needs for the sake of peace, for the sake of keeping everyone happy. But maybe today, for once, she needed to listen to her instincts, to the scream inside her that had been quieted for so long. She stood up, her legs shaky, as if the weight of the decision ahead was too much to bear. The wedding, her family, her role in this charade, it was all so carefully constructed. But there was something much bigger at stake now. A part of her knew that. Her heels clicked sharply on the floor as she walked to the door. She wasn't sure why, but she left the wedding dress hanging on the back of her door. The dress meant nothing now. It was just a symbol of the life she had lived, quiet, unnoticed, always in the background. The dress could wait. Today was about something else. The air outside felt cool, almost damp, as if the city of Seattle had just wiped its face after a tearful night. The engine of her car hummed softly as she drove through the empty streets, heading toward Ethan's office. Each stoplight felt like a decision point. Her mind raced with possibilities. Maybe the message was nothing. Maybe she was overthinking things. But as she continued driving one block after another, her chest grew tighter, the feeling of dread thickening with every turn. She didn't know what she was hoping for. Maybe she was hoping that when she reached Ethan's office everything would be fine, that she'd walk in, see him at his desk, working late just as he always did. She would turn around, laugh it off, and head back to the wedding, but deep down she knew that wasn't likely. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that something was very wrong. She arrived at the parking garage, her fingers shaking as she turned off the ignition. She sat in the car for a moment, letting the silence settle around her. There was no going back now. She stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the concrete, a steady rhythm like the beating of her heart. Every step seemed to echo in the emptiness of the garage. The elevator felt slower than usual as it carried her up to the 3rd floor, the corner unit where Ethan's office was. She had been here countless times before, standing in the doorway, while he wrapped up another late night at work, waiting for him to finish so they could go home together. But tonight, everything felt different. She reached his office door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. The faint sound of laughter drifted through the door, soft, familiar, but not right. A voice she knew all too well. It was Amanda's laugh. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she didn't move. Her heart pounded in her chest. The realization hit her like a freight train. It wasn't just the office. It was them. Ethan and Amanda. Mary closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and slowly pushed open the door. What she saw inside would change everything. Mary's decision to leave her sister's wedding wasn't easy. She had spent weeks preparing for this day, making sure everything would be perfect for Jessica. She had even gotten her hair done, picked out the perfect dress, a muted, elegant mauve number meant to look understated and graceful. She'd been prepared to fade into the background, just as she always did in family gatherings, especially at a milestone event like this one. It was her role. But now, as the minutes ticked by and the wedding ceremony began, a strange, heavy pull had settled in her chest. The message she received had changed everything. She thought she would ignore it, but deep down she knew she couldn't. With one final glance at the dress hanging against the window, its soft folds mocking her own sense of duty, Mary grabbed her coat and quietly left the house. She didn't look back. Her steps felt uncertain, but there was no turning around now. The message had opened something inside her that couldn't be closed again. She wasn't going to let it go unanswered, no matter the cost. The drive was long. The streets of Seattle stretched out before her like a blur of gray and neon, her car headlights cutting through the fog that had started to settle over the city. The wedding, the laughing faces, the delicate flowers in her sister's bouquet, none of it seemed real anymore. The only thing that was real that felt tangible was the cold fear tightening her chest, the voice in her head urging her forward. "Check his office," the message had said. "Don't go to the wedding." She gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles white. The city's skyline loomed in the distance, a silent observer as she hurtled toward an unknown truth. The streets grew emptier as she neared downtown, the buildings becoming taller and colder, standing like giants in the dark. Her thoughts were jumbled, a mixture of confusion and dread. She hadn't wanted to come here. She hadn't wanted to feel like this. But something inside her was screaming to keep going. She remembered those nights, late nights, when Ethan had stayed at the office longer than usual. The way he'd seemed distracted, distant, as if his mind were elsewhere. Her mind flashed back to his words. "It's just work, Mary. Don't overthink things." But now she could feel the weight of those unspoken words, of the tension that had crept into their marriage over the last few months. It wasn't just the message, though. It was the feeling in her gut that something had been wrong all along. The signs had been there. She had been so willing to ignore them. She didn't want to believe it. And maybe, just maybe, this was all a mistake. But the gnawing feeling in her stomach wouldn't let her rest. She drove faster. The faint light of the moon above her was the only thing guiding her now as she took the exit that led to Ethan's office building. She parked in the lot, her fingers trembling as she cut the engine. For a moment she sat there staring at the reflection of her car in the window of the building. The cold air hit her face as she stepped out, the night enveloping her in its quiet, oppressive silence. She could hear her own heartbeat loud in her ears. The elevator ride up to Ethan's floor was agonizingly slow. She pressed the button for the third floor, staring at the doors as they moved inch by inch, giving her no relief. Her thoughts were racing faster than the elevator. She could already see him, Ethan, sitting in his office, maybe working late, maybe just finishing up a report. Maybe nothing was wrong. Maybe the message was a mistake. Maybe. The elevator finally reached the third floor with a soft ping. Mary stepped out. Her heels clicking sharply on the linoleum floor, the sound echoing down the empty hall. She took a deep breath and turned the corner toward Ethan's office. The hallway was dim, the lights flickering as she walked. The space felt sterile, like something out of a dream. The door to his office was just ahead, slightly ajar. Her hand trembled as she reached for the handle, but before she could open it fully, she stopped. There was something odd about the air in the hallway. A laugh, a familiar laugh. Her heart skipped. It wasn't just any laugh. It was Amanda's. The blood drained from her face. She had heard that laugh before. In their home, at family gatherings, in their lives together. But now in this cold office, it felt like a punch to the stomach. Her mind screamed at her to turn away, to leave. But she didn't. She stood frozen for a moment, unable to move, unable to breathe. The laugh continued, followed by a low voice. Ethan. His voice. But it wasn't the voice of the man she knew. It was different. Playful. Intimate. She could hear Amanda again. Then Ethan. Her heart clenched as she stood there, paralyzed by the noise she could now clearly hear through the door. She had to know. With a shaky breath, Mary slowly pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. The scene that unfolded before her eyes was nothing short of a nightmare. Ethan. Her husband sat at his desk, his shirt half open, his body leaning toward Amanda, his assistant. Amanda's head was tilted back, laughing softly, her fingers grazing his shirt collar. Ethan's hand rested possessively on her thigh. The way their bodies were positioned, so comfortable, so familiar, it made Mary sick. The closeness between them, the easy intimacy, was everything Mary had feared. For a long, painful moment, Mary didn't move. She stood there staring at them, watching them laugh together, oblivious to her presence. 1,000 emotions flooded her chest: anger, betrayal, disbelief. But above all, there was an overwhelming sense of numbness, as if her mind had shut down to protect her from the sheer weight of the truth. Her hands gripped the doorframe, her breathing shallow and uneven. She didn't know how much time passed. Maybe seconds. Maybe minutes. It didn't matter. All that mattered was that the life she had built with Ethan was a lie. Without a word, she slowly backed away from the door, making sure it clicked shut without a sound. The hallway felt empty as she turned and walked back toward the elevator. Her legs felt like they might give way beneath her, but she forced herself to keep moving. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The elevator ride down felt like the longest of her life. She couldn't escape the images in her mind. The way they had touched, the way they had laughed together, so natural, so comfortable, as if she didn't exist. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped out into the quiet of the lobby. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't check it. She didn't need to. She was no longer sure of anything. Mary walked out of the office building, her legs moving mechanically as if they weren't even her own. The night air hit her face like a slap, but it didn't bring clarity. She didn't know where she was going, didn't know what to do next. The images of Ethan and Amanda in his office kept playing over and over in her head, each one more painful than the last. She got into her car and slammed the door shut, the sound echoing in the stillness. She started the engine, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The city around her was a blur, lights flashing by the hum of the engine, the only sound in the car. Her mind was numb, unable to process what she had just seen. She had always known something was off, but this was a whole new level of betrayal. She didn't even realize she was driving until she reached her apartment. Her hands were shaking as she put the car in park, and it was only then that the weight of the situation hit her like a ton of bricks. The life she thought she had built was a lie. She stepped out of the car, the air still chilly, but it did nothing to cool the heat inside her chest. The numbness from the office had faded, replaced by something darker. Anger, hurt, confusion. She couldn't understand how this had happened, how she had missed all the signs. Ethan and Amanda, her husband and her best friend, had been lying to her. Not just emotionally, but financially too. Inside her apartment, the silence was suffocating. Mary locked the door behind her, but her mind was far from safe. She walked through the living room, numb, mechanical. She could feel the weight of the space around her, the furniture, the pictures on the walls, all things that once felt like home. Now they just felt like a collection of lies. She needed answers. Her first instinct was to confront Ethan, to scream, to throw the truth in his face. But something held her back. Maybe it was the cold realization that confronting him wouldn't fix anything. There was no going back. He had betrayed her in ways that went deeper than she could understand. Instead, she decided to gather evidence. The truth wasn't just about his affair with Amanda. It was about something far worse. The way they had used her. The way Ethan had betrayed not only her, but the life they had built together. She wasn't going to let this slide. She couldn't. She had to find out exactly what had been going on. Mary sat down at her desk, her hands trembling as she pulled open the drawer. Her fingers brushed over papers, bills, receipts, documents. But she wasn't looking for that. She was looking for something else. Something that could explain it all. She pulled out their joint account records, the ones she had ignored for months. They were always in order, always neat and controlled. Ethan had always been the one to handle the finances, and Mary had trusted him blindly, stupidly. But now, as she went through the records, a chill crept up her spine. She saw the pattern. The withdrawals, the transfers, the small but significant changes in the amounts. It wasn't just money moving around. It was something else. Something deliberate. Her breath quickened as she scanned the transactions. Then she saw it. A series of large withdrawals, more than they had ever spent on anything. She traced them back to a shell company, a company registered in a different state, a company that she had never heard of. Redwater Holdings. The name alone sounded wrong. Mary's heart began to race as she searched for more. She opened the documents one by one, her mind spinning as the puzzle pieces began to fall into place. Ethan hadn't just been hiding an affair. He had been hiding money. A lot of money. And Amanda was in on it. The two of them had set up this elaborate scheme, using her as a front, making her the unsuspecting accomplice in a financial fraud she had no idea about. She felt sick. The betrayal was more than just the affair. It was the complete dismantling of everything she had trusted. She had thought she knew Ethan. She had thought their marriage was built on something real. But now she saw the truth. Everything she had believed in had been a carefully constructed illusion. Her hands shook as she closed the files. She couldn't look at them anymore. The weight of it all was unbearable. She stared at the papers, her mind racing. This wasn't just about an affair. This was about something bigger, something that would change everything. For a moment she just sat there, staring at the documents. Her mind was overwhelmed with thoughts of Ethan, of Amanda, of the life she had lost. She wanted to scream, to shout at them, to confront them right now, but she knew that wouldn't solve anything. It wouldn't bring her back to the life she had thought she was living. She stood up, pacing the room, trying to make sense of it all. The truth was like a weight around her neck. She could feel it pressing down on her, suffocating her, but she knew she couldn't stop now. She couldn't go back to pretending that everything was fine. She had to keep going. Mary sat back down at the desk, picking up her phone. Her fingers hovered over Ethan's name in her contacts, but she couldn't bring herself to call him. Not yet. She wasn't ready. Instead, she called a number she had never dialed before, a private investigator. She didn't know exactly what she needed, but she knew she needed someone who could dig deeper, someone who could find the answers she couldn't see. She hung up the phone after scheduling the appointment, her mind still spinning. The investigator would find the information she needed. But there was still so much more to uncover. She had to know everything. She needed to know how deep this went, how much of her life had been a lie. Mary closed her eyes for a moment, letting the silence fill her. It was the first moment of calm she had felt all night. It wouldn't last. The next steps were going to be difficult. But she was ready. She wasn't going to let Ethan or Amanda get away with this. She wouldn't be silenced. Not anymore. She stood up from the desk and walked toward the bedroom, her mind still processing the staggering revelation. The betrayal cut deeper than she had ever imagined. But now she had a plan. She would find out everything. She would uncover every detail, every lie, and when she did, she would confront them. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about reclaiming her life. She wasn't going to let them erase her anymore. She wasn't going to be the victim. She was going to make them face the truth. And when she did, they would never look at her the same way again. Mary sat at her desk, her hands trembling, but her mind was clear. She had already made up her mind she wasn't going to let Ethan and Amanda get away with this. The affair was bad enough, but the financial deceit, the way they had used her, was unforgivable. She could feel the weight of the situation settling in her chest, but she wasn't afraid anymore. There was no going back. If she had learned anything over the last few days, it was that she was capable of more than just sitting back and accepting what life threw at her. She was going to take control. The first thing she did was go through their joint accounts, the ones Ethan had always managed. She had never paid much attention to them before trusting him to handle everything. Now she scrolled through the transactions one by one, and the more she saw, the sicker she felt. It wasn't just the large withdrawals, those were easy to spot. It was the timing of them, the way money moved between different accounts, between different entities. It was too methodical to be a coincidence. Mary pulled out her laptop and began to dig deeper. She opened up the encrypted email accounts that she had never bothered with before, the ones Ethan used for work purposes, the ones he always kept hidden from her, telling her it was just business. But now it was her turn to take a closer look. As the emails began to load, her breath hitched. She started with the most recent, and slowly, as she read through each one, she realized just how deeply Ethan had been involved in this scheme. Amanda's name appeared in nearly every conversation. They were partners, collaborators in a financial plot that spanned months. Every email was laced with business jargon discussions about projects that didn't make sense to Mary. But the more she read, the more the picture became clear. Ethan and Amanda had been setting up shell companies, creating false invoices and shifting money around to make it look legitimate. It was genius in its complexity and utterly devastating. They had used Mary's name, her financial standing, her trust to set up Redwater Holdings, the same company that was tied to all those suspicious withdrawals. The same company that had been built to hide millions in transactions money that had been siphoned off from the joint accounts without her knowing. Mary felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. The betrayal was deeper than she could have ever imagined. She had been a pawn, nothing more than a name on a paper, a tool to be used in their scheme. She wasn't just the woman who had been cheated on. She was the woman who had been robbed too. And all of it had been happening right under her nose. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the files, the evidence staring her in the face. It was almost too much to bear. She had trusted Ethan with everything, her life, her finances, her future. And Amanda had been there the whole time, a wolf in sheep's clothing, smiling in her face while plotting behind her back. She felt a fury that she hadn't known was possible. But at the same time, there was a strange calmness within her. For the first time, she wasn't just reacting. She wasn't just crying or screaming. She was doing something. She was taking action. She picked up her phone and dialed the number of the private investigator. She'd already scheduled the meeting, but now she needed to move faster. She couldn't afford to wait. The investigator would help her gather the physical evidence, the paper trail, but Mary knew she had already uncovered most of the key details herself. She wasn't just the victim anymore. She was in control. "I need everything," she told the investigator, her voice steady. "I need to know how deep this goes. I want everything. Every document, every account, every conversation. I want them both exposed. I won't stop until I have everything I need." The investigator agreed to meet with her the following day, and Mary hung up the phone. She wasn't sure what would come next, but one thing was certain: she wouldn't back down. Not now, not after everything she had discovered. With renewed resolve, Mary sat back in her chair, staring at the screen in front of her. She wasn't just going to confront Ethan and Amanda with accusations. She was going to come at them with evidence, with facts, with the undeniable truth. She would dismantle everything they had built piece by piece. Her mind raced as she continued scrolling through the emails, each one more damning than the last. She found a trail of money moving from one shell account to another. Each transfer was methodical, each one timed to coincide with their affair. Ethan and Amanda had set this up to be seamless. They had planned it out for months, knowing she would never suspect. And now here she was staring at the proof. She clicked open another file, one marked Redwater Holdings in bold, unmistakable letters. She hadn't seen this one before. As the document opened, her eyes scanned the page, and the horror of it hit her in waves. Ethan had been signing documents in her name. He had opened business accounts, set up credit lines, all without her consent. They had built an empire of lies using her as their foundation. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she held them back. She wasn't going to cry. Not now. She had work to do. In the following days, Mary spent hours poring over financial records, emails, and documents. She would go to the private investigator the next morning, but she couldn't wait. She needed to know more. Each discovery left her colder than the last. Ethan had been siphoning money out of their joint account, making it look like routine business expenses. He'd forged her signature, used her name to create fake invoices, and funneled the money into their offshore accounts. It was as though she had never existed in their world, except as a tool to be used. The anger was building now, but so was something else: clarity. For the first time since she had learned of the affair, she could see the situation for what it was. She wasn't just a victim of betrayal, she was a victim of exploitation, and now she had the power to do something about it. By the time she met with the investigator the following day, Mary was no longer the quiet, reserved woman she had been before. She had changed. The person sitting across from the investigator was a woman who had uncovered the full extent of the lies, and she was ready to take action. "I know everything," she said, her voice firm. "I want you to make sure they can't hide anymore. This ends now." The investigator nodded, but Mary's eyes were already focused on the next step. This wasn't just about catching Ethan and Amanda. This was about reclaiming everything they had stolen from her: the truth, her peace, and her life. She wasn't going to stop until she had it all back. In that moment, something inside Mary snapped into place. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't the helpless woman who had been betrayed. She was a force in her own right, and now she was ready to make them pay. Mary stood by the window, the city lights outside flickering in the distance like 1,000 silent witnesses to her turmoil. The weight of everything she had uncovered felt like a heavy stone in her chest. She had known deep down that she could never truly escape this moment, that sooner or later she would have to confront the people who had betrayed her. Ethan, her husband, and Amanda, her best friend, had pulled her into their web of lies and deceit. Now it was her turn to act. She paced the room, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the papers on her desk. The evidence was clear. Ethan and Amanda had been manipulating her, using her trust to cover their tracks while they plotted behind her back. But the truth was out now. There was no going back. Mary didn't want to be afraid anymore. She didn't want to be the woman who silently accepted betrayal. The days of quietly swallowing her pain of walking away to protect others were over. This time, it was different. This time, she wasn't going to just let it slide. She had taken control of the situation. She had uncovered the lies, and now it was time for the reckoning. But as she stood there staring at the documents, the enormity of what she was about to do began to sink in. Her heart raced with a mix of fear and determination. What would happen when she confronted them? Could she really stand face to face with Ethan, the man she had loved for so long? Could she look Amanda in the eye and not crumble under the weight of her betrayal? The fear was real. She could feel it gnawing at her, creeping into her bones, making her second-guess herself. But then she remembered the messages. The cold, calculated way they had gone behind her back. The lies they had told, the trust they had broken. The betrayal wasn't just about the affair. It was about everything they had taken from her, her dignity, her trust, her sense of safety. They had stolen so much from her, and now it was her turn to take it back. She let out a breath, steadying herself. She wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Mary had spent the day carefully organizing her thoughts. She had reviewed the evidence again and again, making sure she understood every detail. She had marked the key transactions in their bank accounts, highlighted the emails that were most damning, and ensured that she had everything she needed to prove their deception. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. She had to be sharp, calm, and composed when she finally faced them. She had no room for hesitation. Her mind kept drifting back to the moments she had shared with Ethan, the quiet dinners, the late-night talks, the dreams they had built together. The man she thought she knew, the man she had married, had disappeared long before she had ever seen him with Amanda. But now the mask had slipped, and there was no going back. She had to remind herself that the man she had loved didn't exist anymore. He was a fiction she had created in her mind, a version of him that had died the moment she saw him with Amanda. But the hardest part wasn't just Ethan. It was Amanda. She had been her best friend. They had shared so much over the years, intimate conversations, moments of joy, the kind of connection that was supposed to last a lifetime. Now she was the woman who had stood by watching as her friend betrayed her, smiling in her face while plotting behind her back. The realization cut deeper than anything Ethan had done, because Amanda had known her so well. She had known all of Mary's vulnerabilities and weaknesses, and yet she had chosen to hurt her. That betrayal, the betrayal of someone she had trusted like a sister, was the hardest pill to swallow. As the evening approached, Mary stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her outfit for the confrontation. She had dressed simply, deliberately, choosing an outfit that was neither too formal nor too casual. She needed to look like someone who was in control, someone who wasn't afraid. She wasn't sure what to expect from Ethan and Amanda, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to let them see her falter. The fear was still there, lingering in the back of her mind, but it wasn't the same fear she had felt when she first uncovered the affair. This was different. This was the fear of facing her truth, of confronting the people who had shattered everything she believed in. It was the fear of stepping into the unknown, of walking into a room with two people who had once been the most important people in her life, and knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. But she didn't back down. Not this time. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and grabbed the stack of evidence she had meticulously prepared. It was time. Time to make them face what they had done. Time to make them pay. The knock on the door startled her. It was time. She opened the door to find Ethan standing there, looking as calm as ever. but Mary could see the tension in his jaw the way his hands were clenched at his sides. He wasn't expecting this. He wasn't expecting her to know everything. Behind him, Amanda stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. She looked almost defensive, like she knew this confrontation was coming but wasn't ready to face it. Mary didn't wait for them to speak. She walked into the room, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. She didn't look at them. She didn't need to. She had come here with one goal: to confront them, to expose them, to make them understand that they had underestimated her. She placed the stack of papers on the coffee table, letting the documents spill out one by one. The silence in the room was thick, suffocating. She could feel the tension radiating from both of them. Ethan's eyes flicked nervously between the papers and her face, while Amanda stood frozen. Her lips parted in shock. "You thought you could get away with this?" Mary said, her voice low but steady. "You thought I wouldn't find out. But I did." Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but Mary held up a hand to silence him. "No," she said. "I've already heard all the lies. Now it's time for the truth." The words came out sharp, calculated, as though they were a weapon, and in this moment they were. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. "I want you both to understand something," Mary continued, her eyes fixed on both of them. "This isn't just about what you did to me emotionally. This is about the trust you've broken, the life you've destroyed. This is about everything you've taken from me." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Ethan looked away, but Amanda's gaze met hers, guilt flashing in her eyes. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough for them to just feel guilty. It was time for them to face the consequences. Mary took another deep breath, her heart pounding. She had prepared for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the flood of emotions that rushed through her. Still, she held firm. She had come here to reclaim her life, to take back what had been stolen from her, and she wasn't going to let them walk away unscathed. The air in the room was thick with tension as Mary opened the door. Ethan stood there, his face tight with apprehension, his posture rigid. Behind him, Amanda's eyes flickered nervously, unable to mask the guilt she tried so hard to conceal. They had no idea what to expect, but they knew the moment had come, the moment they couldn't avoid any longer. Mary didn't speak immediately. She simply stepped aside, allowing them to enter. Her eyes never wavered from them as they crossed the threshold. The silence hung heavy, and for a moment it felt as if the whole world outside had stopped moving. The city, the cars, the people. It was as if everything had faded into the background. All that remained in the world was this room and the confrontation that was about to unfold. As they sat down on the couch, Mary remained standing. She could feel the cold, calculated strength inside her growing stronger. She had spent days preparing for this moment, gathering every shred of evidence, every email, every bank transaction, every lie that Ethan and Amanda had woven into her life. They had thought they could get away with it, her love, her trust, her loyalty, all of it used as a pawn in their game. But now it was her turn to take control. She reached for the stack of papers she had carefully organized, placing them on the coffee table in front of her. Ethan and Amanda shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between each other. "I don't need to ask you if you know why you're here," Mary said, her voice steady but cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. "Because you already know. This isn't some misunderstanding. This isn't some accident. You've been lying to me, Ethan. And you, Amanda, you've been my best friend." The words hung in the air, each one hitting harder than the last. There was no shouting, no tearful pleas. There was only the quiet certainty in her voice that made the space between them feel even more suffocating. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. Amanda glanced at him, then back at Mary, but still said nothing. They both knew there was no point in denying it. The evidence was too damning, too undeniable. They had been caught in the act, and they both knew it. Mary pressed on, never taking her eyes off them, her hand reaching for the first sheet of paper from the stack. She slid it forward just enough for them to see. The email trail between Ethan and Amanda, their plans, their lies. She watched as their faces paled. Ethan's jaw clenched, and Amanda looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I don't want your excuses," Mary continued. "I want the truth. You've been using me. You've been using my name to launder money to cover up your affair and to build a future that didn't even involve me. You've been making decisions about my life behind my back." She paused, letting her words sink in. Ethan opened his mouth again, his voice cracking with the weight of the situation. "Mary, This isn't what you think," he began, but Mary cut him off with a wave of her hand. "No, Ethan. Don't you dare. You don't get to explain this away." Her eyes were cold now, her resolve like steel. "I've seen everything. The transfers, the offshore accounts, the fraudulent invoices. You've been stealing from us for months. And Amanda," her voice caught for just a moment, but she steadied herself. "You were my best friend. You knew me. You knew how much I trusted you, and you did this behind my back. You've been in on it the whole time." Amanda flinched, her face turning a deep shade of red, but still she said nothing. She was trapped, caught in her own web of lies. She shifted in her seat, but no words came. She couldn't defend herself. There was no defending the truth. Not anymore. Mary could feel the anger rising, but she controlled it. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making them feel the same pain she had felt. It was about making them see the consequences of their actions. She had been a fool to trust them, but she wasn't a fool anymore. She had seen their lies, their manipulation, and now it was her turn to turn the tables. "You have no idea what you've done to me, do you?" Mary asked, her voice low but seething with intensity. "You've broken me, Ethan. You've taken everything I thought I knew about love, about trust, about friendship, and you've thrown it all away. And for what? A few $1,000s? A moment of pleasure?" Ethan's face twisted with guilt, but there was something else in his eyes, fear. Fear of the truth coming out. Fear of the consequences he had been avoiding for so long. He opened his mouth again, his words stammering, but Mary wasn't finished. She slid another sheet of paper across the table, her eyes fixed on Amanda. "You want to explain this?" she asked, coldly, pointing to a document detailing one of the fake invoices Ethan had signed in her name. "This was for a business expense that you both knew I'd never question. You thought you could cover it up by keeping me in the dark, but you didn't know I was watching." Ethan's eyes darted between the paper and her face. He opened his mouth, but his voice failed him. Amanda shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers gripping the edge of the couch as if she could hold on to the last shred of dignity she had left. "You think I didn't notice?" Mary asked, her voice almost a whisper now, but sharp. "You think I didn't see how different you both were? How the lies stacked up? How the excuses started to sound more rehearsed?" She leaned forward, her hands planted on the table between them. "This is it, Ethan. This is where it all comes to light. No more secrets, no more lies. This is your moment. You can't hide behind your charming smile or your excuses anymore. I have everything. You've lost." For a moment, no one spoke. The room was heavy with the weight of the silence. Ethan and Amanda sat frozen, their faces pale, the truth finally crashing down on them like a tidal wave. "I don't want your apologies," Mary said quietly. "I don't need them. You've already taken everything from me." Ethan finally opened his mouth to speak, his voice a strained whisper. "Mary, I never meant to hurt you. It wasn't supposed to go this far." Mary cut him off with a single flat statement. "It went exactly as far as you allowed it to, and now you'll face the consequences." Her words were final. There was no more room for discussion, no more need for apologies. She had exposed them for what they were, liars, manipulators, cheaters, and in doing so she had taken back her power. Ethan and Amanda sat there defeated. There were no more excuses, no more lies to hide behind. The truth had been laid bare, and Mary had won. She stood up from the table, her posture strong, unwavering. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," she said, her voice cold but controlled, "and you'll never hear from me again." With that she turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing in the silence they left behind. They were just the beginning of the end. The morning after the confrontation felt like the world had shifted. The weight of it all settled into Mary's chest as she stared out the window, the city below looking normal, unaffected by the storm that had just ripped through her life. She hadn't expected anything less than this, but somehow the reality still hit hard. She had exposed Ethan and Amanda. Nothing would ever be the same. In the days that followed, things began to unravel quickly. Ethan, once the confident, self-assured man she had married, found himself increasingly disoriented. The sleek walls of his office seemed to close in around him, as though even the very air in the building was turning against him. His business had been built on lies, and now the weight of those lies was crushing everything he had worked for. The first call came from his lawyer. "We need to talk about the Redwater Holdings account," his lawyer said. Voice clipped. "We've received word from a financial regulator. They're looking into the transactions." Ethan sat back in his chair, stunned. He had known there were risks, but he had never expected it to come to this. The money, the fake invoices, the shell companies, he had thought it would remain hidden. But the investigation had already started, and he had no control over it now. The realization that his empire, the empire he had built on deceit, was about to collapse was too much to bear. His company, once thriving, now faced a severe audit with the risk of criminal charges looming over his head. As the phone calls came in, each one more urgent than the last, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was trapped in a storm of his own making. The truth had been exposed, and there was no place to hide anymore. His mind raced, trying to figure out how he could salvage anything, but it was too late. The financial structure he had so carefully crafted, hidden accounts, false documents, was all crumbling around him. His colleagues, who had once admired him for his sharp business acumen, now avoided his gaze. The whispers in the hallways were impossible to ignore. His company was falling apart, and the legal ramifications were only the beginning. Ethan had built his life on lies, but now the consequences were crashing down around him. Meanwhile, Amanda's world was coming apart just as rapidly. She had always been the one behind the scenes, the friend who smiled in Mary's face while betraying her trust. But now her secret life with Ethan was no longer hidden. The affair was one thing, but the financial scheme they had orchestrated together was a much darker reality. Amanda hadn't expected it to go this far. She had always believed that the lies would remain untouched, that Mary would never uncover the truth. But now there was no escaping the fallout. She had been complicit in everything. The emails, the transactions, the manipulation, it was all out in the open. And it wasn't just Mary who had discovered her treachery. The world was starting to see the real Amanda. The news of the financial fraud hit social media quickly. Her name appeared in whispers and gossip, and soon articles were published linking her to Ethan's criminal activities. She wasn't just a woman caught in a scandal. She was part of a web of deception that had been slowly strangling everything in its path. Amanda's family called her. their voices filled with disbelief and disappointment. "What did you do, Amanda?" her mother asked, her voice trembling. "How could you do this to Mary, to us?" Amanda didn't have an answer. She wanted to explain, to make them understand that she hadn't meant for it to go this far, that it was just one mistake, one wrong decision. But she couldn't find the words. She had betrayed Mary, her best friend, her sister, in everything but blood. The shame of it hit her harder than any accusation ever could. The pressure of the world turning against her was suffocating. Every step she took in public felt like she was being watched, judged, her reputation permanently tarnished by the truth that had been exposed. The friends who had once admired her now looked at her with disdain. The people who had trusted her turned their backs. Her position in the company, one she had fought so hard for, was now in jeopardy. As the legal issues began to mount for both Ethan and Amanda, the consequences of their actions became undeniable. Ethan's once thriving company was under investigation for fraud, with the possibility of both criminal and civil charges. Amanda, once an integral part of the business, now found herself on the outside looking in as her association with Ethan's schemes tainted her reputation. Mary watched all of this unfold with a sense of detached satisfaction. She wasn't thrilled by their downfall, but she couldn't deny the feeling of justice that settled in her chest. She had made them face the consequences of their actions. But it wasn't just about the business. It was about the damage they had done to her, to the life she had built with them. They had robbed her of her trust, her sense of security, and her peace. And now they were paying the price. Ethan tried to call Mary several times after the confrontation. He had wanted to apologize, to somehow make things right, but she refused to pick up. She had no intention of hearing his excuses. She had seen everything she needed to see. He wasn't the man she had married. He had become someone else, someone who would lie, cheat, and manipulate to get what he wanted. Amanda, too, reached out, but her calls went unanswered. The silence between them was deafening. She had no one left to turn to. The shame she felt was a constant weight on her shoulders. She had lost everything, her friend, her career, her dignity. The woman she had been before all of this seemed like a distant memory, a person she could no longer recognize. In the weeks that followed, the legal ramifications for both Ethan and Amanda deepened. Ethan's company was under full investigation, and his assets were being seized to cover the fraudulent activities. Amanda was named as a co-conspirator in the scheme, and her involvement in the financial fraud was detailed in several media outlets. The fallout from their actions would haunt them for years to come. Mary, on the other hand, had begun to rebuild. She had hired a lawyer, filed for divorce, and started to untangle the financial mess Ethan had left her in. But the process was slow, and the emotional toll of everything she had gone through weighed heavily on her. She didn't have the luxury of a clean slate yet, but with each passing day she grew stronger. She had faced the hardest part, confronting the people she had loved and trusted, and now she was determined to make sure she would never be caught in a lie again. Ethan and Amanda's downfall was only the beginning of a much larger story. The truth had been exposed, and the price they paid for their actions was steep. But for Mary, the journey had only just begun. The road to healing was long, but she was no longer the victim. She had reclaimed her life, and she was ready to take back everything they had stolen from her. The phone call from her mother came in the middle of the night, an attempt to hold some semblance of family together in the wake of the storm Mary had unleashed. But it didn't go as she had hoped. "Mary." Her mother's voice was soft, but it cracked with confusion. The kind of confusion that only a mother could feel when her daughter, the one she had raised with love and sacrifice, did something that seemed impossible. "You need to fix this. All of this. All of it. You're tearing the family apart." Mary sat on the edge of her bed, the phone pressed tightly to her ear. She could hear her mother's voice, but the words didn't make sense. The anger and disappointment that were so clearly present in her tone weren't directed at Ethan or Amanda. They were directed at her, at Mary. She had expected her mother to be angry, but she hadn't prepared herself for this. Her mother wasn't angry at the betrayal. She wasn't upset that Mary's marriage had crumbled under the weight of lies. No. Her mother's anger was reserved for Mary's actions in exposing the truth. It was her fault for rocking the boat. Her fault for being the one who dared to pull back the curtain on the lies that had kept their family together for years. Mary's fingers tightened around the phone, her grip becoming more of a lifeline than she cared to admit. "I'm not going to apologize for what I've done. Mom," Mary said, her voice quieter than she intended, but steady. Ethan and Amanda had to be exposed for what they did. They hurt me, and they hurt us. Her mother sighed, the sound full of resignation. "You think this doesn't hurt me too? You think this doesn't make me look bad? What will people say? Your sister." The words trailed off, and Mary could feel the weight of the unspoken. Jessica. Her perfect, unblemished sister, the one who could do no wrong in her mother's eyes, the one who had never had to face the difficult consequences of her own actions. "I've done nothing wrong," Mary said, the hurt leaking through her voice despite her best efforts to sound composed. "I didn't make Ethan cheat. I didn't make Amanda betray me. They did that on their own." "You've made a mess of everything," her mother said, almost in a whisper, as if the words themselves might break something else inside her. "This family can't handle this. We can't handle this. And now you're bringing all of this into the open for everyone to see." Mary closed her eyes, feeling the walls close in. Her mother's words were like knives. They weren't about supporting her, comforting her. They were about fixing the image, salvaging the family's reputation. Mary had known deep down that this was coming. Her family didn't deal with conflict well. They didn't deal with truth. They dealt with appearances. "I'm sorry you feel that way," Mary said, the words slipping out like a bitter aftertaste. "But I can't take back what happened. I won't." The silence between them was suffocating. After a moment, her mother spoke again, her voice softer, quieter, but still filled with disapproval. "You're going to be the one who loses everything, Mary. Do you understand that? Your father, your sister, they won't forgive you for this. And I—" She didn't finish the sentence. Mary swallowed hard. "Good night, Mom," she said, and hung up. The weight of the phone call settled like a stone in her chest. She had never felt more alone than she did in that moment. Her mother, who had always been the pillar of her life, the one person she had thought she could rely on, had just condemned her for standing up for herself, for standing up to the betrayal. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had nothing left to cry for. The betrayal, the family, everything had crumbled in her hands, and she couldn't even find solace in the people she thought would stand by her. The next few days passed in a haze. There was no escape from the tension in her home, no refuge from the constant waves of guilt, regret, and anger that washed over her. She had no one to talk to. Her friends had drifted away, unable to comprehend her actions. Her mother had made it clear where she stood, and Jessica, her perfect, untouchable sister, hadn't even reached out to offer comfort. But Mary wasn't ready to break. Not yet. Her loneliness deepened as the days stretched on, each moment feeling like a painful reminder of everything she had lost. She had uncovered the truth, but it had come at a steep price. Her family was shattered. Her marriage was over. The friends she thought she could count on were nowhere to be found. That's when Mary realized something. She couldn't do this alone. She had tried, but the weight was too much for one person to carry. Her first session with the therapist wasn't easy. She had hesitated before calling, unsure of what to expect or if it would even help. But when she arrived at the small, quiet office, she felt the tiniest flicker of hope. "Tell me why you're here, Mary," the therapist. A calm woman with kind eyes asked as she took a seat across from her. "I don't know," Mary said, feeling the weight of the words. "I've lost everything. My family, my marriage. I feel like I don't belong anywhere. Like I'm just lost." The therapist nodded slowly, as if she had heard this before, as if this was the moment she knew would come. "You're going through a grief process," Mary, the therapist, said softly. "But it's not just the loss of your marriage. You've lost your sense of self, your identity in the context of others. It's going to be painful, but you need to give yourself space to heal." Mary didn't know what she had expected. Maybe something more profound, a magic solution that would make everything okay again. But this was something she hadn't considered. Healing. Space. She had been so focused on trying to fix everything, trying to put her family back together, that she hadn't even thought about herself. "Where do I even start?" Mary asked, her voice breaking slightly. "Start with you," the therapist replied. "Start with giving yourself permission to be angry, to be sad. But also start with accepting that this chapter of your life is over, and you get to choose the next one. The journey of healing isn't linear, but it begins with one small step." Mary sat there a little longer than she expected, letting the words sink in. For the first time in weeks, she felt a slight shift. She wasn't sure where this journey would lead, or how long it would take, but she realized that it was a journey she had to take alone. She couldn't rely on her family's approval, or anyone else's for that matter. She had to find peace within herself. Over the next few months, Mary kept going back to therapy. At first it was slow. The pain of betrayal and loss still weighed heavily on her. But with each session, she began to let go of the expectations others had placed on her. She began to slowly rebuild her own identity without the expectations of her family or anyone else. One evening, as she sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, the first real smile in weeks stretched across her face. It wasn't because everything was fixed. It wasn't because the world had suddenly become a better place. It was because for the first time in a long while, Mary felt like she was starting to come back to herself. The road to healing was still long, but at least now she was walking it. One step at a time. And that was enough. The first morning, Mary woke up in her new apartment. She felt the weight of her own freedom settle over her like a soft, comforting blanket. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, bathing the room in a gentle glow. For the first time in months, there was no pressure to perform, no one's expectations to live up to. There was only her. The apartment was small but cozy, a stark contrast to the sprawling home she had shared with Ethan. It was a blank canvas, a place that didn't carry the memories of lies and betrayal. It was hers, and she could make of it what she wished. Each room had been thoughtfully arranged, each piece of furniture a decision she made without anyone's input but her own. She stood by the window sipping her coffee and took a long, deep breath. This was her life now. She wasn't defined by her past or the mistakes of others. She was Mary, and she was starting fresh. It wasn't just the apartment or the job she had landed, though both were milestones in themselves. It was the fact that she had started to rediscover who she was beyond the expectations placed on her by her family, by her marriage, by everyone else. Every day felt like a small victory, a step further from the pain that had once consumed her. Her therapy sessions had helped her break free from the shackles of her old life. But it was the small, everyday moments that had truly begun to heal her. Cooking a meal just for herself, choosing her own music to play in the background, taking long walks in the park without the weight of anyone's judgment. Mary had come a long way from the shy, quiet girl who had always tried to fit into the background, who had lived her life in the shadow of her family's expectations. No longer was she the one who always said yes, the one who went along with things just to keep the peace. She had learned to listen to her own voice, to trust her own instincts, and to stand tall in the face of whatever came her way. Her new job was a significant part of her healing process. It wasn't glamorous or high-powered, but it was something that gave her purpose. She worked as a project manager at a small firm, and for the first time she felt like her contributions mattered. Every task, every decision was hers. There was no more hiding in the background. She had a seat at the table, and she took it with both hands, refusing to shrink away. Her colleagues saw something in her now, something they hadn't seen before. They saw the Mary who was capable, strong, and confident. And though she still had her moments of self-doubt, there was a quiet strength in her, now a belief that she had the power to navigate whatever life threw her way. But it wasn't just her career that was changing. It was her entire perspective on life. She woke up every morning, not with the weight of her past hanging over her, but with a sense of excitement for the day ahead. She had choices now, real, genuine choices. And with each new decision, she was rebuilding herself layer by layer. A few months after moving into her new apartment, Mary received a text from Jessica. It was short, just an invitation to meet for coffee, but it was enough to make Mary pause. Their relationship had been strained for so long, and even though they were sisters, there was a chasm between them that seemed impossible to bridge. But now, with time and distance between them, perhaps things could be different. The cafe where they met was cozy, tucked away on a quiet street. Jessica was already there when Mary arrived, sitting at a table by the window, a cup of coffee in front of her. She looked just like she always had, polished, put together, effortlessly beautiful. But there was something different in the way she looked at Mary. Less judgment, more openness. "Hey," Jessica greeted, her voice warm but tentative, as though she wasn't sure how to approach the situation. "Hey," Mary replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. "It's good to see you." They both sat down, the space between them awkward at first. Neither of them spoke for a few moments, both unsure of how to start. The past hung in the air, but neither of them seemed willing to let it suffocate them. It was as though they both knew the conversation would eventually get to the things they needed to say, but for now they would simply exist in this moment, trying to find their footing. Finally, Jessica spoke, her voice softer than usual. "I know I haven't been the best sister to you, Mary. I don't know what you were going through, but I didn't do anything to help. I was so caught up in my own life, my own wedding. I didn't see how much you were hurting." Her words were raw, vulnerable, in a way Mary hadn't expected. Mary's heart ached a little as she listened to Jessica. She had always loved her sister, but it had been hard to reconcile the image of the perfect sister with the reality of how little Jessica had understood her pain. "I don't think either of us really understood what was going on," Mary replied, her voice calm but honest. "I was trying to keep everything together. I was afraid of losing the family. And I felt like I had to protect everyone, even if it meant losing myself in the process." Jessica's eyes softened. "I never wanted you to feel like that. I didn't know. I should have known. I should have been there for you." Mary took a deep breath. The air between them seemed lighter now, the tension slowly dissipating. She had spent so much of her life in the background, waiting for the approval of her family, trying to fit into roles that were never meant for her. But now she didn't need their approval anymore. She didn't need them to understand her to feel whole. "I'm not the same person I was," Mary said, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm not the person who hides in the background anymore. I've learned to be strong, to stand up for myself. I've learned that it's okay to be different, even if it means standing alone sometimes. Jessica reached across the table, her hand hovering for a moment before she placed it gently on Mary's. I think I've always seen you as the one who needed fixing, she said softly. But now I see you as someone who's already fixed themselves. And I admire that more than I can say. Tears welled up in Mary's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of release, of understanding, of letting go. For so long she had thought that her happiness depended on the approval of others, but now she realized that it came from within herself. She didn't need anyone to save her. She had already saved herself. As they sat there talking and laughing, the connection between them was no longer defined by guilt or resentment. It was defined by the shared understanding of what they had both been through. And in that moment, Mary realized something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. She was no longer alone. Her healing wasn't just about her own journey. It was about finding a new relationship with the people who mattered. She had learned to heal herself, but now she could begin to heal the bonds with her family, one step at a time. The sun was setting as Mary stood on the edge of the park, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. The world seemed to move in slow motion around her, but she remained still, watching her family from a distance. They were gathered near the fountain as they had for years. Her mother was talking to Jessica, gesturing with her hands as she laughed at something one of them had said. Her father stood off to the side, arms folded, looking as if he was half listening, his gaze focused on something in the distance. Mary watched them, but the connection she once felt, the bond that had held her so tightly to them, was now gone. It was quiet for a moment, just the rustle of the wind through the trees, and then the laughter of her mother and sister broke the silence again. They looked happy. They looked whole. And for a brief moment, Mary felt a pang of longing. She missed the days when her family had been her world, when everything felt simple and safe, when the ties that bound them were unquestioned. But then as quickly as the longing came, it faded. She knew better now. She knew the truth. She knew what she had to do. And standing here on the periphery of their lives, she understood that love was not enough to bring her back to a place that had never truly been healthy for her. They were still trapped in their old patterns, living in the illusions they had created. Her mother would always want her to apologize for upsetting the peace. Jessica would always be the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the one everyone relied on to keep things together. But Mary was done. She had been a part of that pattern for too long, too willing to play the part of the quiet, compliant daughter. Now she was standing at the edge, looking in, not part of it anymore, not willing to go back. Not when the price was her own soul. As Mary turned to walk away, a heavy weight settled in her chest. There was no need to look back. She had given her family more than enough chances. She had tried time and time again to fit into their mold, but she couldn't be their second choice anymore. She couldn't be the one who lived for everyone else. Her family was still there, but they weren't her world anymore. They couldn't be. Her life was her own now, and that was enough. Later that week she arranged to meet Ethan. She had no idea what she expected out of this encounter, but she knew she needed it. Not for closure, she had long since given up on that, but because she needed to see him face to face. She needed to confirm in the deepest part of herself that the man he had become was not the man she had once known and loved. They met at a small cafe on the corner of a quiet street, a place that didn't hold the weight of their shared past. Ethan had changed in ways that were impossible to ignore. The man who sat across from her, his hair slightly graying his face, drawn and tired, was a shadow of the person she had married. His eyes, once so full of confidence and charm, now looked wary as if the weight of his own lies had started to crush him. He didn't look at her the way he used to. There was no love in his eyes now, no sense of familiarity, just a kind of hollow recognition, a recognition of the woman who had once been his and who was now sitting across from him as a stranger. "Mary," he said, his voice hoarse, as if he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his head, but still didn't know how to speak. I don't know how to start this. I've messed up everything. I know I've hurt you, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to make up for it." Mary sat back in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't need to hear his apologies. She didn't need him to beg for forgiveness, because forgiveness wasn't what she was looking for. She had already made peace with everything he had done. She didn't need his absolution to move on. She had already let go of that need. "You don't have to apologize," she said softly, meeting his eyes for the first time in what felt like forever. "I don't need your apology. I don't need anything from you. Not anymore." Ethan's face faltered for a moment, his brows knitting together as if he didn't understand. He opened his mouth to speak, but Mary raised her hand, signaling him to stop. "Ethan," she continued, her voice calm and steady, "I'm not here to have some big confrontation. I'm not here to argue or yell or make you feel guilty. What happened between us, what you did, I can't change that. You can't change it either. But I've realized something, and I need you to hear me out." He nodded slowly, a flicker of something in his eyes, maybe regret, maybe fear. "I'm not the person I was when I was with you," Mary said, her voice firm now. "And I'm not going back to that life. I've spent too long trying to fix things, trying to make them right for everyone else. But I can't do that anymore. I have to do what's right for me. I have to live for myself." Her words were like a final release, a weight she had carried for too long finally lifted. It wasn't about getting revenge. It wasn't about punishing him. It was about her own healing. It was about reclaiming her life, her autonomy, her sense of self. Ethan's face softened, but it wasn't with the hope of reconciliation. It was with the understanding that things were beyond repair, that the woman sitting across from him had already let go of everything he had taken from her, and she wasn't coming back. "I've changed, Mary," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm trying to change. I'm not the same person I was." Mary gave him a small, knowing smile. "I know you've changed, but it doesn't matter, not for me. I can't go back to being the person who needed you to change. I've learned to change on my own, and that's enough." Ethan didn't say anything else. He just sat there looking at her with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. There was no anger between them, no more blaming or pointing fingers. The truth had already been laid bare. They had both been hurt, but they had both moved on. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she added quietly. "I don't need it. I'm done with needing anyone's forgiveness to move on. I just need to start over." And that was the final piece of closure she needed. No more apologies, no more regrets. Just the peace that came with knowing she had taken control of her life and that she would never again allow herself to be trapped in a life that wasn't hers. As she stood up and walked away from Ethan, she didn't look back. The past was behind her, and there was no place for it in her future. The final step was the hardest one, but Mary knew it was the only way forward. It wasn't just Ethan she had to leave behind, it was everything. The life she had built, the dreams she had shared with him, the future they had promised each other. She had to walk away from all of it, from the people who had hurt her, from the version of herself that had been defined by others' expectations. She stood in the doorway of their old home, her fingers brushing against the doorframe one last time. The silence inside was deafening. The furniture once arranged with care now seemed foreign to her. Every corner held a memory, Every room echoed with the ghosts of their shared past. But that was the past, and she was done living in it. With a steady breath, Mary closed the door behind her. She didn't slam it, didn't make any noise. She simply shut it softly, the final sound of her old life closing gently but decisively. She didn't look back. There was nothing there for her anymore. The house was no longer her home. The life she had tried to hold on to had been shattered, and now all that remained was her. She had packed her things weeks ago, only taking what she needed. The rest, her wedding ring, her old memories. The pieces of a life that had betrayed her were left behind. It wasn't about revenge. It was about freedom. The freedom to start over, to build something new, something that belonged entirely to her. As Mary drove away, her old neighborhood slowly fading in her rearview mirror, she couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of sadness and relief. She wasn't running from the past, she was leaving it behind. She didn't need to carry it with her anymore. She had paid the price for those memories, and now it was time to let them go. She didn't know what the future held, but that was okay. For the first time in a long time, the unknown didn't scare her. She was ready to face it head on, and she was ready to do it on her own. A few weeks later, Mary found herself in a small office, her laptop open in front of her as she settled into her new job. The work was challenging, but in a way that made her feel alive. She had always been good at managing details, organizing chaos into something functional. But now the work had more meaning. It wasn't just about completing tasks. It was about taking ownership, about proving to herself that she was capable, that she could build something without anyone's help, without anyone's approval. Her colleagues had welcomed her with open arms, and although she still had moments of self-doubt, she felt more comfortable here than she ever had in her previous job. She wasn't just someone's wife or someone's daughter. She wasn't a second choice anymore. She was Mary, and she was finally discovering who that was. Each day brought new challenges, new opportunities. There were moments when she felt overwhelmed, when the weight of the world seemed too much. But each time she reminded herself that this was her journey. She was the one steering the ship now, no one else. The days blurred into one another, each one a quiet affirmation of her independence. She didn't need the validation of her family or Ethan or anyone else. She had everything she needed right in front of her, her work, her new life, her own sense of self-worth. And yet, it wasn't all work and no play. There were moments of stillness, moments when Mary would find herself sitting alone in her apartment, watching the world outside. The city lights shimmered below her window, casting long shadows across the floor. She didn't mind the solitude anymore. In fact, she welcomed it. It was her time to reflect, to simply exist, without the expectations of anyone else weighing her down. She would sit by the window, a cup of tea or wine in hand, watching the ebb and flow of the world outside. People moved quickly, caught up in their own lives, their own dramas. And Mary realized that was okay. She didn't need to be part of their chaos. She had created her own peace. One evening, as she sat in the silence of her apartment, she looked out at the city below, a quiet smile forming on her lips. She had never felt more at home in her own skin. She had built this life on her own terms, piece by piece. She had stopped looking for approval, stopped chasing something that would never be hers to have. She had stopped pretending. The world outside continued to turn, but for Mary the quiet stillness inside her was everything. This was her life. She had created it, and she would protect it with everything she had. A month later, she met up with Jessica again. This time the air between them was different, lighter, less burdened. Jessica had been through her own struggles, but Mary could see the change in her. She wasn't the perfect sister anymore, and that was okay. They had both grown, both had their own paths to walk. But they had learned to accept each other, flaws and all. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Jessica admitted over coffee, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "About how you don't need anyone's approval. I didn't get it before, but now I think I do. You've done something I don't think I could ever do. You've walked away from it all and started fresh. That's brave, Mary." Mary smiled softly. "It wasn't easy, but I had to. I couldn't stay in a life that wasn't mine anymore, and I'm glad I didn't." There was a long pause, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was understanding. Both women had been through their own versions of hell, but now they were here sitting together, sharing a moment of peace that had eluded them for so long. "I'm proud of you," Jessica said, her voice thick with emotion. "I really am." Mary felt a warmth spread through her chest, a quiet comfort she hadn't expected. She hadn't needed her family's approval before. But hearing those words from her sister was the first true connection they had shared in a long time. It was the first time she had felt like they were both standing on equal ground. "I'm proud of you too," Mary said, her voice steady. "We're both finding our own way, and that's all that matters now." As she left the cafe that day, Mary felt something new hope. Not the kind of hope that came from clinging to the past, but the kind that came from knowing that her future was completely in her hands. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be moments of doubt, moments when she questioned whether she was doing the right thing. But for the first time in a long time, Mary was living for herself. And that was enough. The future was hers to create, and she was ready. Ready to take on whatever came next because she knew she didn't have to face it alone anymore. Not anymore. The first session was difficult. Mary sat at the back of the room, hesitant, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The support group was filled with women of all ages, each of them carrying their own stories of betrayal, loss, and recovery. But for Mary, the hardest part was not hearing their stories. It was hearing the words she had been too afraid to say aloud. "I have to learn to love myself again." The group facilitator, a woman named Anne, had asked them all to introduce themselves. "Hi, I'm Mary," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here because I need to find a way back to myself, to the person I was before all the lies. I need to figure out how to forgive myself." The silence that followed felt thick, as if everyone was waiting for Mary to go on to explain more. But she didn't know how. The weight of the words had already drained her, and the idea of forgiving herself, of letting go of the guilt she had carried for so long, seemed almost impossible. But the support group was the first place where she felt she could even begin. Anne smiled, gently nodding her understanding. "It's okay to not have all the answers. We're here to work through it together. Just start with being open. Start with showing yourself the same compassion you would show a friend in pain." Over the next few weeks, Mary found herself attending the meetings regularly. At first, it was difficult hearing other women share their experiences. Hearing the raw honesty in their voices made her confront parts of herself she had tried so hard to avoid. But it also gave her something she hadn't had before, a sense of belonging. She wasn't the only one who had been hurt, the only one who felt lost and disconnected. And through their shared stories, she began to understand that healing wasn't about forgetting, or even about erasing the past. It was about accepting it and moving forward with grace. Slowly, Mary started to learn how to forgive herself. She allowed herself to feel the anger, the hurt, the disappointment, but she also allowed herself to let go of the shame. She began to see that happiness wasn't a destination that had been stolen from her. It wasn't something she had to chase or achieve. Happiness was about living in the present, embracing who she was now, not who she used to be, not who she learned how to love herself again, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet understanding that she deserved to be whole. She didn't need anyone's permission. She didn't need Ethan's apology or her family's approval. She didn't need to play a part in someone else's story. She was finally the author of her own. Her life, for the first time in a long while, felt simple. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. Every day she found joy in the little things. The smell of fresh coffee in the morning, the warmth of the sun on her skin as she walked to work, the feeling of her fingers tapping out the words on her keyboard at her new job each moment was a quiet testament to the strength she had gained. On weekends she spent her time exploring new parts of the city, walking down streets she hadn't noticed before, discovering hidden cafes, small bookshops, and quiet parks. She began to understand that happiness didn't have to come from big milestones or grand gestures. It was found in these small, everyday moments, the moments that didn't demand anything from her but her presence. In the evenings, she would return home to her apartment, a space she had made her own, and sit by the window watching the world outside. The lights of the city flickered the hum of life outside her window, reminding her that the world was still turning, still moving forward. And she was too. She realized that the relationships she had now were different from the ones she had before. She had learned to set boundaries, to prioritize her well-being, to say no when something didn't feel right. Her friendships were no longer based on expectation or obligation. They were grounded in mutual respect, in honesty, and in a deep sense of support. She had learned the value of being around people who lifted her up rather than drained her. Mary was no longer someone who defined herself by the expectations of others. She had learned to stand on her own, to embrace her own desires and needs. And in doing so, she discovered something remarkable. The more she embraced her independence, the more she found that the right people who truly cared about her, came into her life. At work, things were looking up as well. There were moments of doubt, of course. She still found herself questioning whether she was doing enough, whether she was good enough. But those moments were fewer and further between. Mary had found her rhythm. She was contributing in ways that mattered, making an impact on the projects she worked on, and her confidence had grown as she realized just how capable she was. One day, her boss pulled her aside after a meeting. "Mary, I just wanted to let you know how impressed I've been with your work lately," he said, his voice sincere. "You've been a real asset to the team. We're lucky to have you here." Mary smiled, her chest swelling with pride. It wasn't about the praise, it was about the fact that she had earned it. She had worked hard, she had pushed through the doubts, and she had built something solid from the ground up. She wasn't just the person who followed orders anymore. She was a leader in her own right. And in the quiet moments when she sat back and reflected on all she had accomplished, she could feel something shift deep inside her, a sense of peace, of contentment. She wasn't who she used to be, and that was okay. She had become someone stronger, someone who knew her worth and wasn't afraid to show it. It was during one of those quiet evenings as Mary sat by the window watching the city below that she had a moment of clarity. The journey hadn't been easy, and she knew there would still be difficult days ahead. But she also knew that she was no longer running from her past. She had faced it. She had allowed herself to feel everything, the hurt, the betrayal, the loneliness, and she had come out the other side stronger. She didn't need to be perfect. She didn't need to have it all figured out. What she needed was to keep moving forward one step at a time, knowing that she was capable, worthy, and loved, not because of anyone else's approval, but because of who she was. The phone rang, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Jessica. "I'm proud of you, Mary. Truly." Mary smiled, her heart full. It wasn't a fix-all. It wasn't the happy ending she had once imagined, but it was enough. And in that moment, that was all she needed. The morning was still and quiet, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in the background. Mary had just finished her morning coffee and was sitting by the window, watching the slow shift of the day. The warmth of the sun was starting to creep through the blinds, but her mind was elsewhere, far from the peace of her new life. She'd been hearing whispers. News of Ethan and Amanda was starting to surface, and it was not the way they'd imagined their lives unfolding. The truth had caught up with them. It started with the knock on Ethan's door. It wasn't the kind of knock he was used to, no casual, familiar tap. This one was firm, deliberate. It was a police officer, and his words were quick and to the point. "Ethan Marks, you are under arrest for financial fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. You have the right to remain silent." At first, Ethan couldn't comprehend the gravity of the situation. The shock registered first on his face, confusion clouding his thoughts. He opened his mouth as if trying to form words, but no sound came out. He stood frozen, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them clear. How had it come to this? How had his life, his carefully constructed empire, fallen apart so quickly? The officer's voice was steady, but there was no sympathy in it. He didn't have time for explanations. Ethan was read his rights, and then handcuffed his life as he knew it, crashing down with the sharp clink of metal around his wrists. As the police escorted him out of his penthouse, the reporters who had been waiting just outside pounced. The camera flashes were blinding, the microphones thrust in his face. "Do you have any comment on the charges?" "Is this the end of your career, Mr. Marks?" they shouted. But Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was still caught in a whirlwind of disbelief, shock, and anger. How had it all unraveled so fast? His company, his name, his pride, all of it had been built on lies, and now those lies were being exposed. He had known this day would come. He had buried it deep, convincing himself that the risks were worth it. But now, as he was paraded in front of the flashing cameras, he realized the price of those lies, and it was a price he couldn't afford. The charges against him were clear financial fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy with his former assistant, Amanda. The money he had moved, the false invoices he had signed, the shell companies he had set up, they were all part of a well-oiled machine designed to hide the truth. Amanda had been his partner in crime, the one who had helped him cover his tracks. But now it was clear that both of them were facing the consequences. Amanda was next. The day after Ethan's arrest, the news broke that she too was under investigation. It didn't take long for the truth to reach her friends, her colleagues, and everyone who had once admired her. Amanda had always been the one people trusted. She was the best friend, the confidant, the one who seemed to have it all together. But behind the smile, behind the polished exterior, there was a different story. A story of betrayal, deception, and greed. The police had gathered enough evidence to charge her with aiding and abetting financial fraud. They had traced the money, the emails, the correspondence between her and Ethan. Everything she had done was now on display for the world to see. At first, Amanda tried to deny it. She called her lawyer, trying to maintain some semblance of control. She had built a life from nothing, worked her way to the top, and now it seemed to be crumbling in an instant. The legal consequences were serious prison time, fines, and the destruction of her reputation. Her friends, the ones she had worked so hard to impress, turned their backs on her. The phone calls stopped. the messages dried up. Her world, once filled with the approval of others, now felt eerily quiet. The people she had trusted, the ones she had called her closest friends, were suddenly nowhere to be found. The guilt was heavy, suffocating. She had betrayed Mary, yes, but now it was the world that had turned its back on her, and the cost of her actions was becoming painfully clear. She wasn't just facing legal consequences. She was facing a lifetime of alienation. No amount of apologies or attempts at justification could take that back. While Ethan and Amanda were left to face the consequences of their actions, Mary continued down her path. She hadn't followed the trial closely. She didn't need to. The truth had been exposed, and now it was their responsibility to deal with it. Mary had learned long ago that justice wasn't something she could control. She had walked away from the chaos, and now she focused on building her own future. She had made peace with what had happened. The pain of betrayal, the heartbreak, it was still there, but it no longer defined her. She had come to understand that life wasn't about the people who tried to tear you down or the mistakes you made. It was about moving forward. Mary had her new job, her new apartment, and a new sense of self. She wasn't the same person she had been when Ethan and Amanda had betrayed her. She had learned to trust herself, to stand up for what she believed in, to put herself first. Every day felt like a victory. She was making new connections, building relationships that were healthy and grounded in mutual respect. She no longer felt the need to bend to the will of others. Her family was still distant, and she wasn't sure where they stood, but she no longer cared. She had stopped chasing approval and started living for herself. As for Ethan and Amanda, their downfall was a reminder of how fragile everything they had built was. They had lived their lives in a way that prioritized their own desires at the expense of others, and now they were paying the price. Mary's life was moving forward unburdened by the weight of her past. She had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that her worth wasn't determined by the mistakes of others or the way they treated her. It was determined by how she chose to rise above them. And now, with each passing day, she felt stronger, more confident, and more at peace with who she was. Ethan and Amanda would have to live with the consequences of their actions, but for Mary, the future was hers to shape. And it was one she would build with strength, resilience, and a renewed sense of self-worth. Months had passed since the dust of her former life had settled, and Mary felt the subtle shift inside her. The wounds, though still tender, had begun to heal. She had built a life on her own terms, free from the suffocating expectations of her family and the toxic remnants of a relationship that had betrayed her. She was stronger, wiser, and more at peace than she had been in years. But the pull of family, of what had once been, lingered. One evening, as the sky began to turn shades of purple and orange, Mary sat at her small dining table, a cup of tea in front of her, staring out the window at the city she had come to love. The apartment felt like a sanctuary now, a place where she could simply be. But there was one thing she hadn't been able to shake off: the sense of unfinished business with her family. It wasn't about reconciliation, not in the way they had once imagined it. She knew she couldn't go back to being the person who had always placed everyone else's needs above her own. But what if there could be something new between them? Something more honest? She didn't need their forgiveness, and she certainly didn't need to go back to their way of doing things. But a conversation, just one honest conversation, might help her finally close the door on the past. Her decision wasn't easy, and it wasn't without hesitation. The emotional scars from her family's rejection still lingered. But Mary had come to understand that healing wasn't just about moving on from the past, it was about accepting it. So she decided to attend the next family meeting. Not because she wanted to fix anything, but because she wanted understanding. She wanted to see them not through the lens of betrayal or anger, but through the eyes of someone who had grown beyond the pain they had caused her. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon. When Mary arrived at her mother's house, the familiar smell of home hit her like a wave, but there was a strange discomfort that gnawed at her. She hadn't set foot in this house in months, and despite the sense of nostalgia, it no longer felt like her place. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it all in. The house was the same furniture, meticulously arranged pictures on the walls, and the ever-present hum of her mother bustling around in the kitchen. But it was different now. She was different. Jessica was already there, sitting at the dining table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her gaze directed at the papers in front of her. There was a hesitation in her eyes as she looked up, and for the first time in a long while, Mary saw her sister, not as the perfect, untouchable figure, but as someone who had been hurt, too. Her life had been shaken, too, though in ways that had never been visible to Mary before. Mary Jessica said quietly, standing up. "I didn't expect you to come." "I didn't expect to," Mary replied with a soft smile. "But here I am." Jessica nodded, her eyes searching her sister's face, trying to read the unfamiliar strength there. "I'm glad you did." Her mother, who had been fussing in the kitchen, stepped into the living room, her face softening when she saw Mary standing there. "I'm glad you came too, sweetheart," she said, her voice filled with an awkward tenderness. We've missed you." Mary nodded but didn't respond right away. She had come not to rehash old wounds, not to apologize for what had happened, or to demand apologies of her own. She had come because she needed to make peace with the past, and this was the last piece she needed to move forward. "Mom," she said after a beat, "I'm not here to fix anything, and I'm not here to get back into old patterns. But I think it's time we talk about what happened." Her mother seemed to shrink slightly, but Jessica's eyes never left her. It was a moment of vulnerability that Mary had never seen between them before, and it made her heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. For the first time, she realized that her mother wasn't just the enforcer of old family dynamics. She was a person, too, a person who had made mistakes, who had loved in ways that weren't always healthy or helpful, but who had done the best she could. "I don't know how things got so bad," Mary continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't know how we got so far apart, but I know that I couldn't live in the shadows anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't." Her mother opened her mouth to speak, but Mary held up a hand. "I'm not blaming you, Mom. I'm not blaming anyone. I just want to say that I've learned a lot in the last few months. And I think I understand things better now. I understand how I allowed myself to be treated, and how I let my own fear of losing people dictate my life." Her mother's eyes welled with tears, and for the first time Mary saw her mother as someone who had been just as lost in her own way. She saw the cracks in her mother's perfect facade, the cracks that had once been hidden behind stern expectations and a strict, unyielding love. "I didn't know how to be there for you, Mary," her mother whispered, her voice trembling. "I was so caught up in trying to keep everything perfect, I didn't see you were slipping away. I didn't see what you were going through." Mary nodded, her heart softening at her mother's words. "I know, Mom. I know now. But we can't fix the past. All I can do is move forward." The conversation was quiet, filled with long pauses, but it was full of understanding. There were no accusations, no tears of regret demanding forgiveness. There was just the painful truth that they had all failed each other in their own ways, but they were still here, still trying to figure it out. The next step was the hardest confronting Jessica. Their relationship had been fractured for so long, and Mary wasn't sure where they stood anymore. But there, in the quiet of the living room with their mother sitting between them, There was an openness that hadn't existed before. "I've been thinking about us, Jessica," Mary said, her voice quiet but firm. "We've spent so much time in competition in silence and distance, but I don't want that anymore. I want to understand you, and I want you to understand me." Jessica looked at her sister, her lips pressed together. "I don't know what to say, Mary. I'm sorry for everything. I never meant to hurt you, but I did, and I can't take that back." Mary reached out, placing a hand on Jessica's. "You don't have to take anything back. We've both done things we regret, but we can move forward, together, or at least we can try." There was no grand reconciliation in that moment, no perfect resolution, no fairy tale ending. But there was something better in understanding that the past didn't have to define their future. That forgiveness wasn't about making things right, but about accepting what had happened and allowing room for growth. For the first time in a long time, Mary felt peace. Not in the way she had once imagined wrapped in a neat bow of family unity, but in the knowledge that they had all changed, that they had all tried in their own way to understand each other. "I'm not asking for anything," Jessica Mary said softly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for understanding. And if we can start there, I think we can move forward." Jessica squeezed her hand, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I want that too. I really do." And just like that, the weight of years of unspoken words, of hidden resentment and misunderstandings began to lift. They couldn't change the past. But in that moment, they had a chance to create something new, a future where love was based not on perfection, but on acceptance. And for Mary, that was enough. The soft hum of the city felt like music to Mary's ears as she sat in her small apartment looking out over the skyline. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the streets below. For the first time in a long time, she felt completely at peace. The chaos of her past, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the lies had finally settled into a distant memory. She didn't have to look back anymore. Her life was hers to live, and she was determined to live it fully. Her morning routine had become a quiet ritual she cherished. She woke early, brewed her coffee with a smile, and sat by the window watching the world come alive. The noise of the city no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it felt like a symphony, a reminder that life was moving forward, and so was she. There was no more fear, no more anxiety about what had happened or what might have been. The past had no power over her anymore. Mary had settled into a new rhythm. Her work was fulfilling, and the connections she had made in her new job were grounded in mutual respect and trust. Her colleagues were no longer just people she worked with, they had become her support system, and she had found strength in their friendship. Her career wasn't the be-all and end-all of her life, but it gave her purpose, a direction that was hers and hers alone, and she was proud of it. On the weekends, she would spend time doing things she had never made time for before. She would go to the farmer's market, stroll through art galleries, or visit quiet parks with a book in hand. She discovered new parts of the city, hidden cafes, independent bookstores, small shops where the owners knew her name. These simple pleasures were becoming the cornerstones of her new life. There was a calmness to everything now, a sense of grounded peace. The days of living under someone else's shadow, of living in constant fear of disappointing others, were long behind her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. She no longer needed anyone's validation, anyone's approval. She had learned to love herself, and that was enough. One crisp morning, as she sat in the cafe down the street from her apartment, she felt a familiar sense of calm settle into her chest. It was a feeling she had grown accustomed to, the peace that came from knowing she had built something for herself. No longer dependent on anyone's love, approval, or judgment, she was free. As she sipped her coffee, she thought about how far she had come. Her family, though still distant in many ways, had become something she could approach with understanding, not expectation. Her relationship with Jessica had shifted from rivalry to something more akin to mutual respect. Her mother, once a figure of unyielding authority, now seemed more human, more fallible, and Mary had come to terms with that. She didn't need their approval anymore. She had found peace in herself. It was a simple truth, but it felt revolutionary. She was her own person. The phone buzzed on the table, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a message from Jessica. "I was thinking about you today. I'm proud of everything you've done. I know we're not where we once were, but I'm happy to see you finding your own way." Mary smiled a soft, genuine smile. She had never expected the words to come from her sister, but they meant more than she could express. "I'm proud of you too. We're both learning how to move forward." She typed back quickly, her fingers flying over the screen. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, but it was progress. Real, meaningful progress. She set the phone down and looked out the window again, her thoughts drifting. She had learned that healing wasn't linear. Some days were harder than others, and some days she still felt the weight of the past, but it no longer controlled her. Her life now was an unfolding journey, one she was charting alone, and she was okay with that. She didn't need anyone to hold her hand. She was walking on her own 2 feet, and she was stronger for it. It had been a long time since Mary had taken the time to simply reflect on where she was now, to recognize the distance she had traveled. But as she stood by her window later that evening, looking out at the city once more, she realized how far she had come. The lights of the city below seemed to twinkle with a kind of quiet promise, as if reminding her that there was still so much to see, so much to do. For a long time she had been afraid of what lay ahead. The uncertainty of the future had paralyzed her, and the pain of the past had been a constant weight on her shoulders. But now she was ready to embrace whatever came next. She didn't need to know the details. She didn't need to have everything planned out. She just needed to keep moving forward. The realization that she had reclaimed her life, that she had found peace after everything that had happened, filled her with a deep sense of contentment. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about accepting it. It was about finding a way to live without being haunted by it. Mary took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill her lungs. The sound of the city was distant now, almost like a lullaby in the background, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace. She wasn't running from anything anymore. She wasn't escaping her past or trying to outrun the memories. She was simply living for herself. A few weeks later, she stood at the edge of the lake in the park, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It was a moment of solitude, and she welcomed it. She had learned to be alone without feeling lonely. She had learned that peace wasn't about being surrounded by others, but about being content in her own company. Mary stood there for a while, the cool breeze ruffling her hair, feeling the weight of everything she had been through and everything she had become. She had faced so much betrayal, loss, fear, but here she was standing tall, stronger than ever. She had survived it all. She had come out the other side, and she had built a new life for herself. The sky turned from orange to deep blue, and the stars began to appear one by one. Mary took one last look at the horizon, a sense of calm settling over her. She wasn't the person she had been before. She had grown learned and, most importantly, healed. With a deep breath, she turned away from the lake and began to walk. It wasn't about running away from anything. It was about moving forward, moving toward the future, toward the new chapters she would write for herself. She was no longer bound by the past. She had found her freedom. And as Mary walked, the future ahead of her didn't seem so uncertain anymore. She had everything she needed to move forward. Strength, independence, and the knowledge that she could face whatever came next. With each step she felt more confident, more at home in her own skin. The journey was far from over, but she was ready for it. And as she walked on, the world seemed to open up before her, full of possibilities, full of promise. She was finally free.